Welcome everyone to the kickoff of the Great Minds, Brave Spaces speaker series for the 2018-2019 school year. My name is Christelle Hales, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so happy that you are all here. To familiar faces in the crowd, I say thank you for keeping up the momentum and welcome back. To new faces, I am so excited that you've joined us here today, and we're looking forward to seeing you at the future events. The Division of Talent and Inclusion strives to create and institutionalize spaces like this, where individuals from all over campus can come together and share ideas, passions, questions, and food. Great Minds, Brave Spaces is aimed and dedicated to working towards infusing themes of diversity, equity, and inclusion into our daily conversations and thought processes. Together, we will learn just how impactful we can be as a community. We'll get started in just a moment, but before we do that, there are a couple things you should know. One, this event is being recorded for those who may not be able to be present today and still want to engage, so that's in the back. If you have any kind of issue with that, please pull me aside after and let me know. Two, if you haven't registered already, please do so with Bonnie. If you saw Bonnie's face, you're all set. If you haven't yet, make sure you see her in the back. She's waving. Three, the next Great Minds, Brave Spaces event will be October 30th. We're having Robin Oakes, and she'll be talking about Beyond the Binary. If you want to learn more about that, keep an eye out. Four, just kidding. Today at 4 p.m. in the Taylor Conference Room, there's going to be a debrief about this event. The debrief is essentially just kind of a collective coming together to talk about any lingering questions, comments, or ideas you may have after this. Or maybe if you have a speaker in mind for the next Great Minds, Brave Spaces, we want to hear it there. It's really whatever you want to make of it. So that's today at 4 p.m. in the Taylor Conference Room. And now, without further ado, I'd like to present our speakers, Professor Keith Maddox and Professor Sam Sommers. Let's have a round of applause for this. Sorry. Keith Maddox earned his A.B. in psychology from the University of Michigan and his M.A. and Ph.D. in social psychology from University of California, Santa Barbara. He is an associate professor in the psychology department at Tufts University and the director of the Tufts University Social Cognition Lab. His research and teaching are focused on exploring social cognitive aspects of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. The long-range goal of this work is to further the understanding of the representation of stereotypic knowledge and its implications for the behavior and treatment of the members of stereotyped groups. He has served as the special advisor to the provost for diversity and inclusion at Tufts, and has founded an initiative at Tufts that seeks to bring social evidence to bear on the development and evaluation of programs designed to address the challenges and opportunities associated with diversity, climate, and inclusion in organizations. Professor Sam Sommers earned his BA from Williams College and his PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan. Since 2003, he has been a faculty member in the Department of Psychology at Tufts University, where he is now professor and director of the undergraduate studies. He is a social psychologist whose research focuses on issues related to intergroup relations, diversity, and how a group's composition affects its dynamics and performance, as well as the intersection of psychology and law. He has won multiple awards at Tufts, including the Lerman Newberg Prize for Outstanding Teaching and Advising and the Gerald R. Gill Professor of the Year Award. He received an Early Career Researcher Award from the American Psychology Law Society and has won the Faculty Multicultural Service Award at Tufts. He has written 2 general audience books, Situations Matter and This Is Your Brain on Sports, and is also a co-author of textbooks for social psychology and introductory psychology. Please give another hand for Professor Keith Maddox and Professor Sam Sommers.
We're setting up. Should be quick. Famous last words.
Exactly. That's the background. Let's see here.
You can do function F8.
Oh, is that it? Oh, okay, yeah, thank you. Oh, it's the whole extended. Still see the background? Yep. And now you don't? All right, excellent.
Look at that. All right. Should I go? Do I need to wait for camera to go? I'm already recording. You're already recording. Just make sure your mics are on.
Okay, great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
mics are on. Excellent. Hello. Sorry about that. Thanks for being here with us. So my name's Sam Sommers. That's Keith Maddox over there. We're going to do a little bit of a tag team setup here, and we're going to jump right into this. We're both experimental psychologists, so we study the psychology of everyday life and how we make sense of the world around us and how we think about each other and interact with each other, make decisions, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to present to you just sort of one perspective on the science of issues related to bias and diversity and what it's like to live and work and study on a diverse college campus like this and like the one in which we spend our days. And so we're going to jump right into a bit of an exercise here, an exercise that gives you, I think, some insight into the kinds of ways we can think about and study and talk about these kinds of issues. Again, we live in a society where there are all sorts of questions we might want to ask about diversity and bias, and we're only going to be asking a subset of those, but we think they're an important set of questions for all of us who work and again, live on a college campus like the ones that you and we work on. So I'm going to ask you, if you would, to help out with a bit of an exercise. It's a categorization task. And if we were seated in the psychology department on this or any other campus, we'd put you in a research lab in front of a computer terminal with a machine that had keypads that measured your responses within milliseconds of precision. We're not doing that. We are instead doing this at circular tables with delicious pasta and broccoli and breadsticks, which I highly recommend. And instead, so we're going to do the low-tech version of this. And so what I'd like to ask you to do is to take your hands, if you would, and put them on your lap. Your left hand on your left leg, your right hand on your right leg. So what I'm going to ask you to do in this exercise is to categorize a series of words that you see on this screen. Now, one of your tasks will be to categorize words as being either pleasant or unpleasant concepts. So for example, these are some of the pleasant type of words you might be asked to categorize and classify as such. Don't memorize this list. You will see words that are not from this list. But this is an example of the consensus, pleasant, positive sounding words you might be asked to categorize as such. And these are some of the consensus, negative sounding words that you might be asked to categorize or classify as such. That's one task. The other thing we're going to ask you to do is to categorize individuals, or more specifically names. And we're going to ask you to do the same thing. Some of the names that you will be shown are stereotypically white-sounding names, and some of them are stereotypically black-sounding names. So for example, here is a list of black-sounding or stereotypically black names, and here's our list of white-sounding or stereotypically white names. Now, you may be on this first list and be black and not have one of these names. You may have one of these names and not be black. You may have one of these names and not be white. You may be white and not have one of these names. We're not suggesting you were named wrong. We're simply proposing that, like the other words, these are words that we can categorize, classify as being black-sounding names or white-sounding names. And those are your instructions, to classify, to categorize these concepts as you see them. And so the very first trial you'll be asked to do, here are your instructions. We're going to ask you to slap your left side when you see an unpleasant sounding word, unpleasant word, and your right side for a pleasant word. Now, this is not a self-paced task like it would be in the lab. You're going to see all of these words down the screen in a column all at once. And so your task is to go with the top word and to slap the appropriate leg, and then move to the next word and slap the appropriate leg, and to do this until you get all the way to the bottom of that list. Now, the two overarching instructions I give to you as you're doing this are, get these right. So if you make a mistake, and you'll know you do, it's a 50-50 shot, just fix it. Go to the other leg and get it correct. And number two, do this as quickly as you can. And I say that because Professor Maddox over here, Keith, is not just scribbling in his notebook because he's bored. He is actually he's actually going to time us with his phone. And so he's timing you. Now, understandably, again, he can't do this for you as an individual. What we're doing is at the group aggregate level. So when you're done, we'll ask you to raise your hand. Do it as quickly as you can and get them correct. A lot of things will be going on around you, a lot of noises. Some people are fast, some people are slower, and that's all fine. Really, this is about, for you, as much your subjective experience doing this as it is the group level. Don't worry if you're one of the first ones done. Don't worry if you're one of the last ones done. Just keep continuing through and raise your hand. Keith will stop the timer when the vast majority of people, critical mass of people in the room, are done, but you should finish the trial on your own. So, your instructions are in front of you. Left side for unpleasant, right side for pleasant. Start with the top word, go all the way to the bottom of the list. You're going to see those appear in 3, 2, 1. Begin.
stop at 17.94.
17.94. We're rounded up to 18 seconds, a respectable time, but I'm quite confident you can do better. And so here's our second trial. I'm going to ask you to slap your left side for a black sounding name, your right side for a white sounding name as quickly as you can, but getting them right or fixing them if you make a mistake. In 3, 2, 1, begin.
$16.76.
16.7, a new room record. Okay, you've now done 2 what we would refer to as experimental trials. Trial 3 in this experiment is a combination of the previous 2. You now have to do both tasks at once. I need you to slap your left side for an unpleasant sounding word or a black sounding name, your right side for a pleasant sounding word or a white sounding name in 3, 2, 1, go.
$16.38.
16 seconds and change. All right, we are sort of doing a new final set of 3 trials here. We're going to wipe the perceptual slate clean as a bit of a perceptual palette cleanser. I give you different colors now, yellow and red. Some of these, however, are tasks you've been asked to do before, trials you've done before, and some of them will be different trials. This one you've done before. Left side unpleasant, right side pleasant. In 3, 2, 1, go.
$14.51.
14.5 seconds. This trial, I believe, is a reversal of what you've been asked to do in the past. Left side for a white sounding name, right side for a black sounding name. Left side, white name, right side, black name. In 3, 2, 1, go.
$15.92.
15.9 seconds. All right. This next trial, again, a combination of the 2 trials that preceded it. I want you to slap your left side for an unpleasant sounding word or a white sounding name, your right side for a pleasant sounding word or a black sounding name. In 3, 2, 1, begin.
Okay. I'll go 30.5.
All right, I say
I think
30-ish.
I don't think I saw as many
With
hands.
a fair amount of what we refer to as attrition,
Yeah.
Meaning not having fully completed the trial. There are a lot of things we can talk about, and we don't have a huge amount of time. We can spend a whole semester on this, and we won't. And clearly we want to get to the question of why is it that when we do this, having to pair unpleasant and black on one side, pleasant and white on the other side, is about twice as, well, I don't want to say twice as easy, twice as fast at least, as doing it this way, unpleasant and white together, pleasant and black together. There's going to be sort of a question of what does this mean societally, culturally, and so forth, and I want to get to that. But before we get to that, I want you to answer the question I would ask my students in a research methods class. What about the specifics of what we just did, the task itself, the way these slides were put together, the instructions you were given, the nuts and bolts of what you just did? What about that do you want to ask about and know about, or at least raise consciousness about before we can even talk about the bigger picture questions of what this does and doesn't mean? What's the first thing you want to sort of raise your hand and say and propose as something that's relevant to think about after having gone through this? Yes, you had a hand up.
The order of operations matter in terms of like if you had started.
Yeah, and I see a lot of people nodding their heads. Does the order make a difference, right? Because it feels very much, and I've had people say things before, like, we've had people say things that, like, it feels like we learned something, we learned it one way, and then we had to, relearn it and do it a different way, and that was harder. So would we find the same thing if the order were different? If, for example, the yellow and red trials had come first, and the blue and the green trials had come later, and that's a very good, intuition, question, hypothesis. It's what it feels subjectively like when we go through this task, right? It turns out that the order doesn't make a big difference, and there are a variety of ways in which we know that. Some of those ways are not that persuasive to you because you just met us a half an hour ago. You have to trust us, and so that's not really that compelling. But we have two versions of these slides. The task has, we've hidden slides, 8 slides, and we just sort of at random pick which way to do it. We've done it the other way as well, where the yellow and red comes before the green and the blue, the exact same task otherwise. And it indeed still takes twice as long to do yellow and red as it does blue and green. And the first question people want to ask is, well, is there an order effect here? Because it feels like the first time we had to do both things at once, it was confusing, and I couldn't keep that straight. But the second time we got better at this, and I got practice, and I did better. And so it feels subjectively like the order we do things makes a big difference. I will also note that just from our own data, trial 5 was 15 seconds and change. Trial 5 was the time where you actually had to switch something, where you had to switch which side you did white and black, and you had no trouble with that. That was a very fast trial for you. It was something specifically in the room about that last trial that was particularly challenging. The best response, though, to the question about order, has anyone taken a test like this before online, by show of hands? My guess is a fair number of you have. What you just took is a low-tech version of the implicit associations test that researchers at Harvard and Yale and University of Washington and University of Virginia devised several years ago now. And you can take multiple variations of the IAT online. You can take this test for, as we just did, unpleasant, pleasant, white and black individuals. You can take it for other racial or ethnic groups. You can take this test for, based on sexual orientation and gender and political affiliation and body type and age and a variety of other factors. 80 million, I believe, people now have taken the race IAT that we just took, the variation that we just did here in person. And when they do that online, they're able to counterbalance everything. What the order is, it's random. Which side is which. So if you were thinking, well, I had trouble with the left-hand side things because I'm left-handed or I'm right-handed, that sort of gets balanced across time on the online version of the test. If you were thinking, those names are interesting. The names are more than just about race, though. There's for me at least, a familiarity difference. I'm more familiar with some of those names than others. For anyone who's taken this test online, it's not names. Does anyone remember what it is? Faces, it's photographs. And the research suggests that the order, the side that we're on, whether we would use images instead of names, the results would be slightly different, of course, they always are, but more or less we'd find the same sort of pattern. And about 75% of individuals who take this test online tend to exhibit the pattern that we saw here in this room. The idea at the bottom is harder than the top, or takes longer than the top. And so this idea that order is something we need to investigate, absolutely. Turns out that order really doesn't have a major impact here. What other question would you want to ask, or questions might you want to ask about this example, this exercise, before we can think about what it does and does not mean? Yes? The demographics of the audience, does that make a difference? Which is also an incredibly important question, right? I just told you what the data look like, and I'll be more specific now. The data when white Americans take this test is such that 75% on average find it more difficult to do the bottom than the top. And one hypothesis there might be that, well, if you're a white individual taking this test, there's sort of an us and them distinction going on here, and are we not perhaps more likely to associate positive with us and less positive with them in any sort of domain? So if we have a predominantly white room, a predominantly white audience taking the test, maybe we would find something along those lines. So one question we might ask is, well, what would happen if we were to give a test like this to a room and a demographic that was either all or predominantly, let's say, Asian American. Let's say an identity that's neither us nor them in this forced choice dichotomy of race that we've imposed upon this question. What might the data look like in that scenario? And we can get hypotheses. There are competing predictions as to what might go on in that situation. The data among an Asian American response sample is about 75%, show that it's harder to do, or takes longer to do the bottom than the top, suggesting, well, suggesting what? Does anyone want to sort of offer us what an explanation or an account might be that would explain why you would find that same pattern of results, in this case, between white Americans and Asian Americans? What conclusion is that pushing us towards? What's responsible for these effects?
Right here.
An implicit bias, and where is it coming from? It's not. It can't just be an us versus them, me versus in-group, out-group, right? It must be something else. And what might that something else be? History, media. Yeah, you were going to say? Media, yeah, go ahead. and sort of just cultural messages that come from history and media and role models and a variety of other sources, right? It suggests there's something perhaps culturally going on and societally. African American respondents, a great deal of variability in response from any sample, but for African American respondents, you tend to see about 50% showing this same pattern, where the bottom takes longer than the top, but about 50% showing either no preference or the other way around. It's a complicated story, but it is not the case that it's only white people and that in this scenario, it's exclusively about seeing the self as more positive. It seems like it's something more than that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn things over to Keith to talk a little bit about why this is happening, but I want to leave you with 3 specific conclusions about that task. Number 1, associations like these are pervasive. We just showed that at least in this room, and in most rooms where we've done this, people have an association between whiteness and pleasant, and in this case, between black and unpleasant, that is stronger than the other way around. And you articulated for us maybe some of what that message is from the standpoint of whiteness being normative or pleasant or positive and so forth, and the ways in which we're exposed to that message regularly. But not everyone in this room showed that same pattern of results. We probably have people in this room who, for that matter, didn't grow up in this culture, or not. We're not born and raised or even raised in the United States. And I've had people say, I didn't know what those names were. They were all American names to me. I didn't know white or black. And that's obviously a very reasonable response here. But I guarantee you, if you give us enough slides and enough of your leg-slapping stamina, we'll find the groups for which everyone in this room, myself and Keith included, show these kinds of associations. Maybe it's not white and black. Maybe it's different ethnic groups. Maybe it's sexual orientation, gender, and a variety of other demographics. But these kinds of associations between social identity categories and other concepts are ubiquitous. They're pervasive. And they can be unconscious. They persist even when we don't want them to. My guess is also if we went around this room and asked everyone what their thoughts are with regard to bias and difference and so forth, we would hear people say things like, it's really important to me to be egalitarian and to treat everyone the same and to recognize differences and so forth. And I think we'd all really genuinely believe that, even if maybe some people are doing it more for public lip service than others. But I think we believe that, and that's great. But that in and of itself doesn't get us out of this conversation, right? That in and of itself isn't enough to say, well, we don't have to worry about these things now. Because what the research tells us is that these associations can be unconscious. They can persist even when we don't want them to. My guess is that if we polled the audience in this room right now, most people would say, no, I wish that those data had not turned out that way. I would have rather seen the result look like something else. And number 3, they can influence our judgment and behavior. In this case, they influence how quickly you slap the leg. Doesn't sound like the most profound of conclusions, but this was not just a mental exercise. This influenced your categorization ability. And we're going to argue that it influences other things, decisions, judgments that we make, behaviors we engage in, and so forth. You'll note the word can. They can influence us. We're not hopelessly at their mercy, but they can have a very real behavioral impact. Keith's going to tell us a little bit about why these stereotypes are so pervasive.
Okay, thank you. So I want to transition into talking a little bit about why, and with a little bit of a caveat. So normally we'd like to spend a lot more time sort of deconstructing that particular task and getting people's feedback on it, because it's a really important sort of premise to what we're about to talk about, this idea that there are ways in which you may be thinking about the world that are sort of not accessible to you, and yet those things can still have an impact on how you may act and interact with other people. And opportunity to sort of interrogate that idea and spend a little more time with it. We wish we could spend more time doing that today, but we invite you to visit the IAT website, learn a little bit more about that particular task and ways in which it starts to reflect on our ideas about implicit social cognition. But in addition to that, there's lots of other sort of opportunities to look at different evidence. So I know that there are researchers here on this campus that do interesting research around these kinds of issues, and so not to completely burden them, but the idea is that you might be able to look. Exactly right. So Dr. Sorenko. So the idea is that hopefully you'll take today and what we talk about here today and use it as a beginning of a conversation to interrogate and sort of understand these things. But for now, we want to ask you to just sort of give us a little bit of a suspension of disbelief, if you will. So if you can accept the premise, even though you may have some disagreements about the nature of that task and what it might be revealing, just listen to the rest of the story before you make up your mind altogether. And the nature of that story is this, that what we're trying to do is provide people with a slightly different perspective from a traditional perspective on how we think about bias. We typically think about bias as being something about bad people and good people, that bias is something, let's say racism, sexism, heterosexism, etc. All those things are about people who have problems, who for whatever reason have a different way of looking at the world in a way that disadvantages people of certain groups and certain backgrounds. That is absolutely true. Those people do exist. The idea of racism and sexism and heterosexism, homophobia, those are ways in which we can characterize other individuals. But there's another side of the story, and it has to do with the fact that maybe it's not just those bad people. It's not those bad apples. It's a little bit of all of us, that we all have, to some extent, the potential to exhibit these kinds of biases in ways that may not necessarily be consistent with how we think about ourselves, but yet can still have the kinds of small but cumulative impacts that can address or that can help to explain some of the disparities that we see in the outcomes and achievement levels of people of different groups across this society and then other societies as well. So that story is a little different, right? It's a slightly different perspective, and I wanted to spend a little time telling you about why we think that's the case. So evidence from tests like this, the implicit association test and other types of implicit bias tests, can give us that perspective in terms of helping to measure sort of the level or the magnitude of bias about different kinds of groups. But in terms of trying to explain why it might be something that characterizes a lot of people, it's basically, at least the conclusion we've come to, is that it has something to do with something we all have in common, and that's the fact that we are all human beings. So the idea that we're all human beings, we know that human beings have brains that are very similar to one another, brains that have evolved over time to handle certain kinds of tasks that have been, or challenges that are presented into their environments. They've evolved to deal with those tasks, and through that process of evolution, one of the characteristics that we use was as Sam mentioned, we have to be able to categorize things. It's a beneficial thing to be able to look at something and decide what it is. But the problem is that when we categorize things, oftentimes that's kind of a shortcut, because sometimes we use some very surface characteristics to decide what it is and don't go a little bit deeper below the surface to understand more about that particular individual's or that particular individual object's unique characteristics. But that idea categorization, it's a shortcut that we use. So categorization is a kind of a shortcut that people use, again, to deal with sort of all the information that might be affecting us at any particular time. So this process of categorization, we think what people do is that they use pretty salient or observable kinds of characteristics, at least in this context of visual categorization. They use those things that they think are relevant to deciding whether something belongs to a certain group or not, and then use that to help to make a decision about that. So just to give you a bit of example, you're going to see 3 images here. They're going to start out pretty pixelated, but just tell me what you think they are aloud. So just say it aloud as soon as you recognize it. Okay, so not too subtle sort of analogy here is that you were able to see what those things were before they came into full resolution. All you needed was a bit of the outline. You used those sort of characteristics about structure, background, contrast to make a decision about what those things were. You also, for the most part, agreed in terms of what you called them. You called one a table, called one a couch, maybe some sofas. You called one a chair and maybe some stools. There's a lot of consistency around that, but again, part of the reason that we are able to do that is because we've had an experience where we have learned through our experience when objects look like that and people point at them and they give them certain names, we learn what those names are, and then when we see other things that look like those things, we use those names to describe them. That's a great shortcut to have, because now every single thing that looks like a table, I don't have to go and investigate every element of it and learn it in detail. I can make some assumptions about what that thing is and how I'm going to act and interact with it. So it's a really, really useful shortcut that we can use to be able to categorize these kinds of objects. But as you can imagine, that useful shortcut has some shortcomings because, again, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to look below the surface. We're going to decide what it is and maybe use that decision to try to make a decision about how to interact with it without necessarily looking a little bit further. That's fine when it comes to objects, but it's not so fine when it comes to people. Just to give you a little bit of an example here is that when it comes to objects, if you see something that you've never seen before, for example, a couple of different images, you can also take these new things, these ambiguous things, and try to put them into your categories to make some decisions about whether you're going to eat off of one or sit off of the other or sit on the other. So the idea is that, again, it's a very useful process to be able to categorize, but when it comes to people, it has some downsides. One of the downsides also comes from some research in cognitive psychology when we try to think about ways in which the categories can bias the ways in which we look at the individual things that belong to them. So I'm going to tell you about a quick study that was done by Henri Tajfel and Wilkes. It was published in 1963, and it was a pretty simple demonstration of the power of categorization. So what they asked people to do is to present, or they asked people to watch a number of lines that were presented on a screen. So they would see several lines, and those lines were pretty much the same width, but they varied in terms of their lengths. So in one condition, you would see a series of lines appear one at a time, and your task was to sort of remember something about those lines, try to remember them so that you could recreate them later. In one condition, you just got the lines. In another condition, in a label condition, you saw the lines, but the lines were also presented associated with a label. So in this case, you might see a line that had a label of either an A or a B. Now, in this condition, what they did is they actually had labels that were correlated to some extent with the characteristics that the lines might have had. So as I mentioned, some of the lines were longer and some of the lines were shorter. In the lines condition, you saw all the lines sort of as they were. But in the labeled lines condition, all the lines that were labeled that were a little bit shorter had the same label, whether A or B, versus the other lines that were longer had the same label. So the idea is that now you have these things that have unique individual characteristics, but now you've got a label associated with the shorter lines and a label associated with the longer lines. The question is, what does that do to people's perception and ultimately their memory for what they saw? And the results of that study showed that the memory was biased in this condition where we had labels. So in the no labels condition, what they basically remembered was fairly veridical, right? The idea that there were different lines of different lengths, and they remembered sort of the individual variability across those lines. But in the label condition, they started to remember the lines a little bit differently. They saw that there were lines of different lengths, but then they sort of categorized them as being sort of short lines and long lines. So they lost that sort of individual variability amongst the lines within each one of those groups. And as you can also sort of see, they exaggerated the sort of difference, at least perceptually, the difference between those two groups. So assuming that things that belong to the same group are more similar to one another than they actually are, and assuming that things who belong to different groups are more different from one another than they actually are, that's a consequence of just categorization, of just seeing something and putting association of a label or a group with it. And the idea is that that process isn't limited to non-social objects. It's also the ways in which we categorize people and the consequence of categorizing people. When we make a decision that somebody is male or somebody's female, or that somebody's a Democrat or a Republican or a Red Sox or a Yankees fan, we recruit a whole bunch of information that we've had about those individuals in the past, and we apply that information to these new individuals in ways that may not necessarily be consistent with the traits and characteristics that they have. So the conclusions from this particular part is that we have categorization as a process that we use, and we've evolved to categorize things, objects, any information that we get in the world, and it's incredibly useful in lots of ways. But we have to remember that that process, while useful, can have some consequences. Again, consequences that are more problematic when we're thinking about the social groups that we make judgments about as opposed to other types of groups. The difference that I talked about there in terms of the ways in which we misperceive within groups and across groups, that probably sounds pretty familiar to you. It starts the idea of stereotyping and prejudice, right? The idea is that we have stereotypes about particular individuals based on the groups that they belong to, meaning that we see them as having very similar kinds of traits, and oftentimes those traits are different and distinct from people who belong to other groups. So this categorization process is also the same process that underlies the development of stereotypes that we have about people and the development of the prejudices that we may have that make us feel that people are different from us in some ways. And that process and the creation of those stereotypes, again, is something that's a cognitive byproduct, if you will, of the kinds of brains that we have and the ways in which those brains have evolved. The problem here is that those stereotypes that we have, we're not always aware of them. And particularly when we're not aware of them, they can guide lots of different ways in which we look at the world. So in a way, stereotypes are like the lenses through which we look and view other people's behavior. And unfortunately, they can guide a number of different things. The kinds of things that we see or notice about other people. They can guide the kinds of information that we might remember about other people. They'll guide the kinds of things that people can tell us about themselves or about others that we actually will believe. They guide the kinds of ways in which we influence our behavior towards other people. And then obviously they can also explain the kinds of behavior that we see amongst other people. Stereotypes are these sort of knowledge structures, if you will, that are lenses through which we look at the world. And those lenses provide a lot of explanatory power about the different ways in which people act and the kinds of consequences of their actions. So what we'd hope to be able to do today is to provide you with at least that kind of perspective, that the ways in which we process information about the world, it's not necessarily about bad people per se. There's a little bit of this that's a consequence of all of us being people in and of themselves. We're just human beings, and some byproduct of being human beings leads to some of the stereotyping and prejudice that we tend to see in society. So to help to back that up, Sam's going to give you a little bit of an example of some empirical research that looks at some elements of ways in which stereotypes can influence our behavior.
Thank you. All right, so what I'm going to do is give you at least one, maybe two, we'll see if time permits, but examples of what some of the effects of stereotyping might be. Because as Keith suggested, a lot of what goes into these processes of bias are byproducts of our normal and natural ways of thinking about the world. But that, again, doesn't get us off the hook. That's not offered as a way to mitigate or exonerate these phenomena as they occur and to absolve us of our own responsibility in thinking about and trying to do better in these contexts. And so let me show you one example that I know we have time for here, and that is the domain of evaluating resumes. By show of hands, who in this room, as part of their job on this campus, ever looks at resumes or has to evaluate resumes? I guess there's a fair number of people. And you know, we don't do it that often as faculty, but we do. We have job searches and have to look through faculty candidates sometimes. So Marianne Bertrand and Sendel Moloniafen, two economists in 2004, did a study where they sent out resumes and wrote a paper called "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?" The title of the paper tells you what they did in their study. In fact, the names that we use at the beginning in that exercise came from the same database that they used in their study. And what they did in this experiment, in this study, I should say, is they sent out resumes to thousands of jobs in, I believe it was actually Boston. It was Boston and Chicago. And they sent out 5,000 plus resumes to actual jobs in administration and staff types of positions across different domains of employment and in different industries. And what they were interested in is the simple question of how many resumes would it take to get a callback, right? When you're applying for jobs, that is the first question, the lowest level of responses. Am I even going to get a callback? Is someone going to get a callback, and do I proceed further down the road? And what they did was they created these resumes and they varied the names that they associated with these, they put on these resumes. Some of these names were names that sounded white. Some of these names were names that sounded black. They give you examples of Emily and Greg versus Lakeisha and Jamal. So how many resumes did it take to get a callback? Resumes with white sounding names, it took 10 on average to get a callback. You send out 10 resumes to get one response and perhaps move forward in that application process. Resumes with black sounding names, 15 it took. So one response you might have is to say, oh, well, there's a difference, but that's not a big difference. That would be a bad response. That's a very big difference. That is 50% more, right? It takes 50% more resumes when you have a black sounding name in the study just to get a callback, right? The lowest level of response you hope for as someone who's a prospective employee. And in this study, again, you've got human resources managers, people in these office staffs evaluating these resumes. I'm sure they're well-intentioned and good-hearted people. They're probably trying to do the right thing. They're probably flipping through dozens, if not hundreds of resumes very quickly, and all sorts of little things sort of stand out, right? The font, misspellings, things that you might see on a resume and maybe you don't even always articulate, though those you might articulate. In this case, the names in the resumes made a difference. In fact, what they're able to find in this study is that having a white-sounding name was equivalent in terms of how persuasive it was or how well-received the resume was to having 8 additional years of experience on that job resume. That's a pretty powerful research finding, right? The degree to which the name on the resume made that big a difference. That's one example of ways in which these kinds of processes might play themselves out. Let me give you, what's that?
We have like 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get us to you doing, is there a way to do this? Will that let me skip right to it?
I think.
Or I just have to skip
maybe
through it?
right click, I think. Hold on a second.
Well, I can just skip through, it's fine.
Yeah,
Here, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Can I see that? I can't see that.
Oh, no, don't do that. I'll skip through it. This will be fast.
You think so? Okay, go.
Yeah.
All right.
Here, do this. We don't need that. Boom. And so there are many examples, actually, that we could give in a variety of different domains. But I want to make sure to turn things over to Keith to think us through this question of what do we do about these kinds of processes. He's going to start with this idea of making implicit processes explicit. Again, we've been talking about here, and the exercise at the very beginning was this illustration of the ways in which unconscious biases can influence our behavior and without our conscious awareness, obviously. One thing we've been trying to do in this brief presentation with you is get you thinking about ways in which we can be more conscious about these processes and then start to strategize about them. I'm going to let Keith talk us through that, though.
Okay. All right. Again, apologies for the rush toward the end here. But the idea is that we're giving you just a really small sample of a lot of empirical research that suggests that the kinds of stereotypes that people have, whether you're aware of them or not aware of them, can have an influence on the kinds of judgments that you make about people who belong to different groups. Obviously, the concern that we have is that that might lead to different kinds of opportunities in society that are inconsistent with our egalitarian norms, and hence we think we'd like to do something about it. So most of you are most likely well-meaning individuals who probably think about themselves as being unbiased, yet what we're hoping to do is challenge you a bit to suggest that even that doesn't necessarily insulate you from the possibility that some of your judgments may necessarily reflect or may reflect some of these biases. However, what we think we can offer here is a little bit of a sort of primer in terms of thinking about what we can do about this going forward. One of them, at least what we're trying to do here, is the idea of making these processes that are somewhat implicit a little bit more explicit. So what we're suggesting is that, these implicit processes, it's not necessarily the case that you personally can exert some control over whether these things happen. They feel a little bit more like gut reactions, and oftentimes if you're sort of going with your gut, it's not a lot of thought that's going into it. Yet, at the same time, knowing that your gut reactions may be biased in terms of some of the associations that you have, then suggests that maybe there's opportunities that you may have to correct for some of that bias in the types of judgments that we make. So this idea first, one, we have to be able to acknowledge that people really are different. This is not about describing the world as being colorblind or in some way. We don't want to be colorblind. A lot of ways in which people differ based on, and that's a blanket term, but just think about people who belong to different kinds of groups, whether they're racial or ethnic groups, other types of groups. There's something about that identity that's important to them. To be blind to that is devaluing to some extent some elements of those identities. So it's not about colorblindness. It's about acknowledging that people can, in fact, be different. Maybe not different in the ways that we tend to exaggerate, but different in meaningful ways nonetheless. So being able to acknowledge and talk about that, talking about race, racial differences, other types of differences, is incredibly important, although challenging, but still important. So also recognizing that sometimes stereotypes can cloud our judgments. If you can sort of buy into the premise that we're offering here, that even though you might think about yourself as being egalitarian, you may still be subject to the use of stereotypes in your judgments, recognizing that is another really big step. If you can't recognize it, then you're not going to make any motivation or have any motivation to move forward to try to deal with it. And what we then want to talk about is this idea of strategizing, trying to figure out ways that you can minimize the impact of the kinds of judgments that people may make, you and others, not necessarily changing those judgments or changing them. What I wanted to suggest is that, as Sam mentioned, so if you're not, just because it's something that's sort of a characteristic of human beings in terms of how we process information, it doesn't really make us off or take us off the hook. The idea is that we're pretty smart. When we think of ways in which we make judgments about people or other types of natural processes that have negative implications for people, we're smart enough to figure out ways to address them, right? One of them is declining vision. It's not like we just say, oh, well, declining vision is a characteristic of human beings, let's just live with it. We make glasses, we make contact lenses, we do corrective things. We are smart enough to use technology or whatever means to try to intervene, to try to increase and create a little bit more egalitarian, a little bit more benefit to people in society. It's the same kind of thing with talking about stereotyping and prejudice. You don't just give up because it's a natural process. You start to think about ways in which that process is having an impact, and then you strategize to minimize that impact. So one thing that we can talk about are sort of ways in which, or things that we know from research about when stereotype use is most likely, and you're going to recognize lots of these situations. When the judgment that you're making is something ambiguous, you're not quite sure of what the decision is, stereotypes can tip you in one direction or another. When the judgments are subjective, when it's sort of up to you and there's no real quote-unquote objective criteria, that's another time when stereotypes can tip you in a direction. When you're mentally busy or distracted, if you have a lot of cognitive things going on, right? So if you're busy or overloaded, the idea is that those are the perfect opportunities for people to take shortcuts, to not necessarily dig deep and look deeply into the information that might be available. Stereotypes can tip you in a particular direction there. And then also when we're sometimes feeling threatened or insecure, oftentimes that sort of sense of defensiveness where we sort of close off the opportunities for other people to evaluate us, that kind of closed-offedness, that closed-mindedness, is also more likely to be associated with the use of stereotypes about other individuals. So these are situations that aren't unique to many people, right? Everybody experiences some of these to some extent in many of the contexts that they find themselves, particularly as here we're talking about the workplace, where you have a lot to do. Some of the judgments you have to make aren't necessarily clear. Sometimes it's a judgment call that's on your part, and then oftentimes you're sort of sometimes worried about what people might be thinking of you. All those characteristics are true of anybody who has a job or who operates and works in social environments. So We think that these are all situations that can be ripe for the use of stereotypes. And so the idea is to start to think a little bit about when we know about these situations, these are the opportunities that stereotypes can have to have influence, what can we do about them? And what we want to suggest is that knowing a little bit about some of these processes can help you to make some decisions about where you're going to intervene. So the kinds of things that we would typically talk about and go into a little bit more detail about have to do with those things. If there are judgments, for example, that are just up to individual people, if an individual person, let's say, has particular biases, then the idea of increasing diversity of the individuals who are going to be making that decision. We can't get rid of any individual's biases, but a diverse group of individuals are going to have different biases that sort of basically cancel each other out. And so the idea is that group decision making often can mitigate some biases as long as those groups are diverse and not homogeneous. And that's one kind of example. But there's other types of examples of ways in which you can intervene if you know that this is potentially a problem. So today what we hope we did is to spend some time trying to give you this perspective that, you know, if you look for solutions that have to do with kind of rooting out all the bad apples, it's going to help you with some elements of bias and trying to mitigate bias. But you need to think about the fact that it's not just the apples. Maybe there's something about the barrel. And sometimes that means we're going to target our interventions to changing characteristics of the barrel, if you will, like that metaphor, right? The idea is that the culture, the climate, the environment in which people work, that can have an influence in terms of the kinds of messages that we get about groups, and it can also have an influence on whether or not those messages get expressed in terms of determining those groups' outcome. So focusing your efforts not just on changing people, but changing context, changing culture, is a really promising direction to try to address mitigating bias in any organization. Thank you all very much for your time today. So Christelle, I don't know, do we have time for questions? Okay, so if anybody wants to ask a question, obviously you're free to go if you need to or would like to. Yes, in the back.
Are there any interventions that have been shown to change people's, how they do the perception test or the implicit bias test over time? Like, are there any interventions that have been shown to reduce people's implicit bias?
Yeah, so there is actually a great researcher named Calvin Lai who was at Harvard for a while. I'm not quite sure where he is now. But he did a test where he tested a number of different types of interventions, not just him, but across a number of different labs. I can't tell you everything that worked, but the ones that worked were ones that tended to be a little less focusing on individuals and more focusing on the context of individuals' learning. So for example, providing people with salient counterexamples to, let's say, the traditional cultural pattern of stereotypes. So, you know, making, if it's the black-white difference, for example, creating and increasing the salience of positive black individuals relative to relatively negative white individuals, that can have some kind of an impact in terms of mitigating the kind of bias that you would see, that people in those contexts, when they're reminded of those individuals, they tend to show less of that negative or anti-black bias on that test. And so that's a very sort of simple well, put it this way. It's an intervention that works in an experiment, but if you want to extrapolate that, what it suggests is that if we create sort of context in which people are surrounded with more examples of individuals who are positive in those contexts, as opposed to going along with the cultural, you know, whatever the status quo is, creating that kind of environment can also sort of have an influence on mitigating the kind of levels of implicit bias you have. And as you can also imagine, that would, it would increase the likelihood that you'd see individuals who are role models in those contexts. So in that sense, changing something about the environment that people are learning and working can have an influence on the kinds of implicit associations, and then you can also see how that might have benefits that lead to not just sort of interpersonal implicit associations, but the kinds of opportunities that people might have in that organization as a whole. Something else? Yeah? Okay. Yes?
So let's say that you do that kind of or something for an individual test, right? So you put the black with the positive behavior in that case. How does that extrapolate to their other biases? So do you see then, by making very specific or targeted changes to an environment, that a person becomes more aware of the breadth of their implicit biases, or do you have to target each?
It's not,
Yeah.
there's no, unfortunately, there's, as you might suspect, there's no easy answer and short-term thing that makes change that a lot of these interventions are not very long lasting. Sometimes they work for a while and they might be context dependent. And so researchers are continuing to try to figure out ways to address that. And another way to answer the same question is to think about how best to structure the decisions and the environments and the context in which you're operating such that even if these kinds of biases are there and people are bringing them with them, that the tasks themselves, the judgments themselves, the evaluations themselves are structured in such a way so as to make them maybe less problematic or less influential. So the search committee maybe talks about these issues, reads a couple papers on this kind of issue, thinks about, okay, can we articulate ahead of time what the values are that we're prioritizing for this search, and thinking about now, does that cover all the kinds of people we'd like to see here, or are there other factors we'd like to bring in with, and sort of structuring the task in a way that it's not rushed, it's not completely subjective. There's some criteria that have been established ahead of time, and so the structural revisions and edits are sometimes not easier, but even more influential in the long run too.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add to that, maybe the focus shouldn't always be on sort of affecting anybody's level of implicit bias, but I think the idea is that other kinds of interventions that, again, it may not be the case that you can affect implicit bias in general. So you may, I guess to maybe use an analog, if you, let's say, focus on the black-white distinction and only focus on that, it's likely that it's not going to spread to other levels of biases that people may have. But there are other things that you can imagine that, okay, so again, not just focusing on that distinction, but thinking about racial groups in general, thinking about gender, sexual orientation. Some of these things are going to be correlated with kind of the efforts that your organization might be attempting to do in terms of building, raising the diversity of the individuals who are in that organization, thinking about the cultural climate, the kinds of activities that are opportunities for people, whether or not those activities are things that people of different groups feel comfortable or welcome and part of. So lots of those other sort of elements of trying to address the climate of an organization that tend to make people from different backgrounds who haven't traditionally been a part of that feel a little bit more welcome. Those things can also have an impact, not necessarily on the implicit sorts of associations you have, but it can also have an impact in terms of just the ways in which those individuals might feel welcome. And then you can imagine people who feel welcome and feel comfortable, they act in those organizations. They feel more comfortable, they feel better, they feel more engaged, and they're going to perform a little bit better too. So I think those kinds of efforts, again, there's not a lot of evidence in terms of how they affect the implicit associations, but they can affect more of the explicit sort of outcomes that people experience. Yes?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by useful, right? I mean, sometimes our biases, both implicit and explicit, line up. I mean, people have implicit biases against snakes and poisonous spiders, but they line up pretty well with their explicit biases. So I'm not sure the implicit bias does a whole lot for us there other than to, when we see a snake slithering in the periphery of our vision, we react quickly and run away in a way that we don't have to wait and say, oh my God, snake, what's the base rate of poisonous snakes in this area? We can act quickly. From a social perception, a social component, I mean, to phrase it as are these biases helpful becomes problematic because the bias has obviously a negative connotation to it. Do the quick cues that we pick up on in an interaction, are they useful to us sometimes? Certainly. There are times where we pick up in an interaction nonverbals or something that suggests that this is someone who's friendly or someone who's hostile, and that can be useful information to us. The idea of these biases based on group membership, they're pretty problematic in the long run when we're in a scenario where we're supposed to be evaluating someone's work or evaluating someone's contributions to whatever discussion we're having. It's hard to see a bias in that sense as being adaptive or useful for us, again, given that our objectives in most of these interactions are to evaluate the student's work for what it is, the quality of the work, or to evaluate the people who are coming in and applying for this job based on their potential to contribute to this job, and so forth. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
There's another part of that I was thinking. So the idea of, the kind of expertise that people can develop in a certain domain, I think sometimes the judgments of experts often are a little bit more like gutty judgments. Sometimes they can't necessarily articulate, but they've got a pattern of experience over time that allows them to make better decisions than people who are novices. And so from that perspective, that kind of bias is good because it helps you to make better decisions, assuming that the database of information that you use to create that expertise isn't biased in some way. So if there's bias built into what you've learned, then the expertise that you developed isn't going to be really useful because it's going to just reflect that bias. So it really has a lot to do with sort of whether or not the information that's out there is veridical, and you're learning that information, if your expertise is based on, sorry, vertical is like one of those words nobody ever uses, I'm so sorry. But if it's like, if it's true, if the information that's out there is true, and you're learning that to use and develop your expertise, then that's gonna be a good kind of bias to develop. But I guess the problem that Sam is articulating is that a lot of the ways in which we've learning about different people of different social groups is based on a history of discrimination that, again, most of us would think is unjust. And so if you're learning from that database that's got bias built into it, the kinds of expertise that you develop about different groups and people of different groups, it's going to reflect that kind of bias too. So I'd say, yeah, in general, it's a bad thing. Yes?
So, background to the, I guess, question. So I'm in the Career Development Center, so I'm totally intrigued by the we, in our career fair that we just had, we did pronoun stickers that people could use, and there was some conversation ahead of time about that really the gender shouldn't play a role in someone's hiring. However, if you're in front of someone, there's, just like if you would use pictures, there is judgments based on what someone's seeing. So I guess, as we're going to look at some of those things that are, there's biases based on things that are part of our identity in a way that we need to some people want to clarify. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I don't know there's a tremendous amount of research on, for example, pronouns specifically, but as you mentioned in the question, right, there are cues that are going to be picked up on in a face-to-face interaction period. When we're talking about, well, not necessarily race and ethnicity, but often race and ethnicity. Certainly sexual orientation or religion, not necessarily, though sometimes there may be outward indicators of those as well. I mean, certainly if you are going to clarify what your pronouns are, you are going to, what pronouns you use, you are going to be articulating for the other individual your social category membership. And when you do that, you open the door to the increased possibility of judgment being made along those lines. But to be fair, those judgments are happening anyway. And so at some level, it's that trade-off, and it may very well, I would think in many instances, be worth it to the individual in question to say, hey, if you're going to be making all sorts of judgments, even just categorizations based on my appearance, I'd at least like to explain to you the right ones to make. But that is, of course, I guess, the dilemma in that context.
Yeah, and I think, another element of that is, so we talked, and I kind of talked about this idea of, a lot of times people have a colorblind ideology where they don't want to mention these things, they don't want to bring them up. And I think that that's problematic because it often then, if you don't bring it up as a possible factor, then nobody can try to correct for it. They can't deal with it. So if there's some potential for bias that nobody's talking about, and it's the elephant in the room, people may go ahead and make decisions or judgments that are, again, reflecting that bias. But if there is a potential for bias, it's really important to sort of talk about it and talk about what it could be doing to your decisions. And again, having that conversation, particularly in a group of people who maybe don't have the exact same potential biases, a group that's less homogenous and more diverse, then that opportunity, at least it gives you a chance to recognize that it's possible that it could be having effect. And maybe you decide ultimately that it's not making an impact on your judgment. But having that conversation is important. It gives you the chance to decide whether or not it might be making or biasing or having an impact on people's perceptions. So we're really big advocates or proponents for getting people to talk about these kinds of issues and not sort of feel uncomfortable discussing them because they're, maybe afraid of potentially appearing biased to other people or thinking that it's inappropriate. Creating these sort of contexts and search committees and other opportunities for people and groups of people to talk about these issues. And again, frankly as possible, it's going to give us the best chance to try to come up with ways to cope with them and to deal with them. Yes?
I have sort of a two-part question, and the first is very similar. When we did the implicit association test, obvious, like you can categorize those immediately.
Sometimes, but yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, it has similar research. Like, maybe
Yeah.
like a certain type of behavior that's associated.
Yeah.
Which sort of leads into my next question, which is you talked about adding bias by giving like
Yeah.
but I feel like in doing doesn't stereotypically demonstrate.
Oh, yeah.
And so I don't know. I feel like I'm wondering if you have any insight on.
Yeah. Well, to maybe address the second one first. So the idea that, so I think what he was reflecting is that, you know, that oftentimes, if you think about it, in the context of our society, you have sort of a stereotype of black people, and let's say it has 10 traits that are associated with it. And so there's some people who maybe appear to reflect all 10 of those traits, whereas somebody else who might be a member of that group but doesn't have all of those traits. And it's possible that that means that person's one of those positive exemplars, right? One of those positive role models. And so the question is whether somebody like that is going to have an influence on our attitudes compared to somebody who's a little bit more typical. Is that fair to say? And I think there's some evidence to suggest that that's definitely the case, that people who are members of the group but not typical members of the group are often thought of as exceptions to the rule. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, you know, they're not really black. I mean, I'm not sure how many people have heard this kind of characterization of themselves or of other people, but there's ways in which people will, again, sort of place you as sort of like it as a special condition of a particular group because you don't necessarily share some of the traits they think that group should have. So it's possible that those individuals aren't as impactful, and I think there's some evidence to suggest that that's true. But I think maybe to reify the point I was making, it's like, so it's not just one role model. One example, if you think about having a diversity, a wide range of individuals who, again, counter those kinds of beliefs and expectations and counter them in different ways, then in that sense, you don't necessarily have it all falling on the one or single or even a few individuals. If you can have a broader range of individuals, then they're, as a group, more likely to have kind of an impact on people's judgments. The other thing, unless you had something to say, the other part about the sort of the more non-visible characteristics, so not necessarily using the implicit association test, because for that one you do need to have something that people can actually at least seem to categorize pretty quickly. But there have been some people who have tried to explore things like, so for example, sexual orientation, right? You can imagine looking at another individual, you can't necessarily tell whether they're gay or straight, but there's some research that suggests that people do see certain kinds of cues that they do assume that belong to gay and straight people. And in fact, I think some of that evidence suggests, so that the less PC term is gaydar, if anybody's ever heard this. There's some evidence that some of those things really are to some extent kind of correlated in kinds of judgments in which we categorize people. But again, it's not like 90% accurate. So the problem that we have is that there's this overgeneralization, that if you see those traits and characteristics and you overgeneralize that to suggest that they belong to a particular group, you're making a mistake. So those things can come to us sort of implicitly, but I think you're right. At least what you're suggesting is that trying to combat those things are a little bit more difficult. But I think, you know, talking about the possibility that these things can happen is one strategy, and then other types of strategies will come with more, you know, more research and more conversation, I would think.
Out of time, which tells us.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.